I think a good way of explaining objective morality is to compare it to mathematics. They're very similar in the sense that neither of them really physically exist, but they have to be logically consistent. Calling it objective doesn't really imply that like there's a set moral code out there like the Ten Commandments. I'm going to be looking at it from a more like secular standpoint. But essentially, like look at mathematics. It's not physically there. They're like a number three. We all know what a number three is, but there is no such thing as a number three. We can't touch it. We can't, like, it doesn't exist in the universe. It's a concept, not a physical object. It's something we just made up, but it still has a purpose. It's still linked to the real world in a sense that we can use it as a tool to tie in with the real world. Morality works in a lot of the same way. You must be logically consistent with your principles. Morality must be universal as well. So what applies to one human being must apply to all other similar human beings. And the reason I say similar is to exclude like people with certain mental disabilities or like a newborn child. Basically people that just are incapable of following a moral code. Just that small portion, very small portion of the population that we can't hold to as high a standard as anyone else. But for the most part, everyone is expected to follow a certain moral code. Just about everyone. And it doesn't really make logical sense for me to say that 2 + 2 = 4 sometimes and 2 + 2 = 5 at other times, especially when I'm referring to the same object. So it shouldn't really make sense from a moral sense to say that, oh, this group is allowed to randomly do this to you, but you're not allowed to do it back to them, or you're not allowed to initiate this, but they are to you. The idea is like if it's universal, then what applies to them, these other people, apply to you as well. And just as calculus is built upon like basic addition, complex moral principles are based off of very simple principles. I personally base my morals off the principle of consent, which can be proven using examples like giving versus stealing, or the one that seems to convince most people, the idea of sex versus rape. Nearly everyone would agree that, hey, sex, morally neutral, maybe even moral, but at least morally neutral, and that rape is considered immoral, or not even considered, it is immoral. The only difference between these two is the basis of consent. Rape and sex, the only difference is consent. One is voluntary, the other is involuntary. If this is the only difference, which as far as I can tell this is, then therefore we can conclude that consent determines if an action is immoral or not. I take the concept of sex, morally neutral, you remove consent from it, it becomes immoral. So we can then extrapolate this to all other concepts. If you take a scenario that has consent, we can say maybe it's moral, it's morally neutral, maybe it's immoral for another reason, but we can at least say that if you were to remove consent from it, it then becomes immoral. And by looking at morality at more of an objective, like logical standpoint, we can now be a lot more consistent with our principles and make sure we're not playing favorites. We're not justifying something that is wrong, but we're just justifying it in our minds for a certain reason. We can really think through it and tell, okay, is this good or is this bad? And the nice thing is that overall is really simple. I mean, just figure out what your principles are. This is the principle of consent is one of the simpler ones. But there are a few others, such as like property rights, self-ownership, that they kind of link together for the most part. But overall, once you figure this out, then you can become consistent, and you can then figure out if what you're doing truly is good or not, or if in certain circumstances you're being a hypocrite. But let me know what you think. Leave a comment. Does this make sense to you? Do you see a flaw in my format of thinking? I would say like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more. It helps me out. Visit nkreider.com. That's nkreider.com to see everything that I do. And morality is a very important part of society. And if we don't have a strict moral code that is logically consistent and universal, then do we really have civilization?